And I'm going to just talk to you a little bit today about othering and belonging, and try to focus on identity and polarization. So some of you will be hearing stuff again. Some of you will be hearing stuff for the first time. So first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about the journey we've been in, not just at the Institute, Othering and Belonging Institute, but also in the larger society. And so we started in much of the world with extreme inequality and in fact, even hierarchy, believing and acknowledging, advocating that some people were better than, higher than, superior to others. Excuse me, not that that's gone away. There are still people who make those claims. But in many of our societies and many of our lives, we move to a concept of equality. And like all these concepts are important, but we don't know exactly what they mean. They're contested. In the last 15, 20 years, we realized that equality is not enough because people are not situated the same. So you don't treat someone who is sighted and someone who's not sighted the same. That's maybe equality, but it's not equity. So we moved to equity. And in our practice of equity, we actually looked at those disparities between groups. And oftentimes we just focused on the disparities, and not realizing that even the group who's at the top of the disparities is not necessarily getting what that group deserves or needs. And so at the Othering and Belonging Institute and beyond, we started talking about targeted universalism. Well, the universal is not just simply what the dominant group has, but it's what all of us deserves. But we're not situated the same. So in order for us to get what we all deserve, we have to be targeted. And that's leading us to belonging. And that's what I'll be talking about today. So now we're in a belonging frame. So all the way from inequality to targeted universalism and belonging. And it's a journey though. And in a journey, you don't necessarily arrive. And as Rochelle, our esteemed leader, sent me a little cartoon, and the cartoon was the question, is it the journey or the destination that we should be most attached to? And the answer is, it's the company. And I must say, we have at the Institute and with all of you, we have really wonderful company. And so I think the journey and the destination, if we ever get there, will also be pretty wonderful. So we're in a world where there's extreme polarization. This is not just a US phenomenon, this is a global phenomenon. And the question is why? And part of it is being driven by the rapidity of change that we're experiencing. And those changes happen along many different axes, but climate change, tech change, the pandemic, economic, globalization. And of course, one of the most important ones is demographic change. What change does when it happens real fast, not just to humans, but to any mammal, it puts stress on us. We can only process so much change in a short period of time without feeling stress. But how we understand that stress, how we understand that change depends on leadership, stories, narratives, structures, and organizing. And so our leaders help us tell us this change that you're feeling, this change, this experience that you're experiencing, this anxiety. There are two big stories. There's a third story, but I'll focus on the two big stories. So one of them is you feel uncomfortable. You feel like this is not the country you were born in. Something's off. The world is out of kilter. One story is it's somebody's fault, that there are people who are not like us. They don't look like us. They don't love like us. They don't behave like us. They have a different religion. It's their fault. And so it directs this anxiety into anger. And this anger morphs into a sense of deep othering to the extent that sometimes the group that's then targeted is seen as not human. They're not part of the we. So that's called breaking. When you think of people who are quote unquote different as somewhat different than you and a threat. So the fear and threat is central to understanding breaking and polarization. There's another story The story that, yes, the world is changing. We just we're struggling with coming out of a pandemic. Parts of the world are still very much in it. But instead of turning on each other, let's turn toward each other. Let's recognize each other's suffering. We all have suffered this last year, and we've all suffered in life. Tell me your story. Who are you? I want to see you. I want to recognize you. And in doing so, we actually develop connections. We don't become each other, but we start to actually suffer with other people. And suffering with is what's called compassion. That's called bridging. So bridging tells larger stories about a more belonging we, where we all have a shared vision for the future. So we've talked about, again, we have these leaders, these oftentimes strong men, occasionally women, but more oftentimes strong men, who curate this story and tell us to be afraid of each other. And this trend is happening all around the world. Now, it's interesting and it's important because some people, in the context of the United States, may think, well, Donald Trump is no longer president, hooray. I probably would join in that. But the conditions that created polarizations, that created this anxiety is still there. And so we're in the midst of something quite profound, where we're watching people try to come together, as reflected in the uprisings and the demonstrations for the killing of George Floyd. And I'm sure all of you know about the conviction of Derek Chauvin yesterday. We had millions of people, all different races, all different nationalities, all different sectors coming together saying, this is not right. We need to do something. And then here in the United States, January 6th, we had hundreds, if not thousands of people organized largely around white supremacy and white hierarchy, saying, we want our country back. And in essence saying, the country doesn't belong to people who don't look like us. So othering happens across many different lines. In a sense, it's an empty container. And society decides to fill it in. Society decides how important some characteristic is. So you're not naturally othered. It doesn't matter if you're, quote unquote, different in some fashion. That's not what makes othering. It's the stories we tell and how we treat people. And we can make up any kind of story. Once those stories are in place, though, they become powerful and they become consequential. What we're seeing in our country today is certain identities are attacked. And as identities become attacked, they become more important. So if you attack someone because of their sexual orientation, that will become extremely important. Their identity will become more salient around that. And what we see happening today, though, it's not just individuals. We see groups. We see the elites sort of stacking identities and attacking identities. What that means is that if you are, in this case, a certain political party, there's a number of other things that are associated with that. So it's not, we have multiple identities, but when those identities become aligned and stacked, there's a risk of them becoming harder. When they become harder, it's more likely that we're going to polarize. There's another way of approaching it where we say we have multiple identities and they're fluid. They're not completely aligned. And there's even internal contradictions. That actually creates an openness, which creates a greater possibility of bridging. So the more rigid we are in our identity, the more that we identify with just one aspect that actually then is stacked on other things, it's harder to get change. It's harder to actually see the humanity in other people. So identities is something we have, but it's also something that happens largely outside of us. So identities can be mobilized as a threat, they can be weaponized, or can be a source of belonging. So again, if we can create identities that are fluid, and we all have multiple identities, we all have multiple stories, it creates more possibilities for both connecting and creating something new, or we can weaponize identity in terms of flattening. Now, when you other people, or when people are othered, they become two-dimensional. they don't become complex people. So George Floyd is like, he's not a brother, he's not a father, he's a black man that's a threat. So when people are other, when people are marginalized, not only do they lose their status in society, their stories, which is told by a more dominant group, the stories become very flat. And so one of the things, this is important for us to hold on not only to our stories, in other words, complexity and messiness, but to other people's stories as well. None of us are just one thing. And that creates the possibility of belonging. So when we think about othering, when we think even about polarization, we think about why are we othering these people? In whose interest is being served? And one of the things I'm suggesting in the talk today is that the elites play an oversized role in terms of othering people. And it's not simply because they dislike people. It's not simply because there's antipathy toward blacks or gays or people with disability or whatever. It's also serving oftentimes other purposes, including financial purposes and power purposes. You recognize this. This is the what happened in Central Park, really at the same time that George Floyd was being murdered, where a black man was there as a bird watcher and a white woman was there with a dog, not on lease, in Central Park, New York. And she called the police and threatened him first, and then she called the police and announced that a black man was threatening her. She was using his blackness to trigger a threat, to activate a threat, knowing, calling the police, saying a black man is here, activates all kinds of stereotypes, all kinds of threats, all kinds of. Now, he didn't fit the stereotype. What's the stereotype? I'll let you fill that in. But he's in Central Park watching birds. That doesn't come to mind to most people when they think of a black man. Black man bird watcher? We all are complex. In this case, it turned out okay, but it could have turned out very badly. It's interesting. She knows, or she knew, that by activating his blackness and being a white woman, that a lot of stories, a lot of narratives come to mind. So we weaponize each other's stories sometimes in order to dehumanize people and to deny them full access to society. And that's what's happening in terms of our political breaks between the Democrats and Republicans. And I know we are nonpartisan, and I want to respect that. But our history suggests that the Republicans have actually, in a sense, used the other, the racial other, the Muslim other, the transgender other, as a weapon in order to create a kind of hard white supremacist cohorts. I'm not saying that everyone in the Republican Party are white supremacists, and not even saying that people who actually engage in this rhetoric, like the former president, believe it, but they use it, they politicize it. And then you get group polarization, not just individual. People become sorted in different groups. So the Republican Party in the 1960s in the United States was just as likely to support civil rights for blacks, just as likely to support women's rights, just as likely to support environmental rights as the Democratic Party. That's not true anymore. The Republican Party has basically pushed all the moderate Republicans out and has started to organize around white supremacy. Now, I won't go into great detail on this, but in the United States, people think about a two-party system. It was really a three-party system. There were Democrats, Republicans, and the South. And the South was deliberately, explicitly, and its most important organizing principle was white supremacy and black subordination. And what's happened is that the Republican Party has really become the party of the South. The South has actually imbued the entire Republican Party, and now the whole country is being polarized. Two quick points. One is that I'm not talking about, and I want to emphasize this, white people. There are many white people who reject this, and the few people of color who embrace this sort of ideology of white dominance. Ben Carson just had an article in the paper embracing the idea of white dominance. But it's not just an idea, it's also reflected in our structures. So how we organize space, how we organize zoning, how we organize our schools. So it's not just ideas. The way we other, or the way we say we belong, is also reflected in our culture and our structures. Right now, we're in a particularly difficult time. Again, not just in the United States, but throughout the whole world. And a lot of this is driven, the engine for this, the fuel for this is not climate change, it's not tech change. The fuel for this is demographic change, which actually then gets organized around the other. Not just other things go away, but the other becomes really important. At the extreme then, the container itself starts to break. The very thing that's sort of background assumptions that held us together. And when that happens, everyone starts feeling othered. Everyone starts feeling even more anxious, and you get the spiraling effect. And you see this in data where both Democrats and Republicans feel like the other is an existentialist threat to our very way of being. So how do we fix this container? Because if we don't fix the container, even though we may not think about it in our respective communities, it will affect every aspect of our life. As we saw in terms of the coronavirus, why is wearing a mask political? Why is it that white Republicans or white evangelicals are least likely to get a vaccine? And this is a lack of trust in government, the whole thing with claiming fake news. So the container is broken. Now that's scary, but it's also an opportunity. We're not going to just, I don't think, patch up the container. We actually are called to actually create a new container, a container where all of us belong. So we have a chance to move beyond polarization and to move toward co-creation. So belonging is at its core about not just joining something that's already there, but about co-creating the thing that you're joining, but co-creating it for everyone, not just your group. And it's really important to hold on to this. The belonging is not just belonging for your group, it's belonging for everyone. So at the Institute, we talk about the circle of human concern, and that circle actually extends beyond humans to include the earth and others, where no one is outside the circle. And that's not easy, but that's our charge. So identity matters, and it happens at different levels. And you may notice, you might think it's out of order, that self, community, world. No, it's community, self, world. We don't have a self unless we have a community. And we're literally coming to the world attached to another human being. And without having that initial community, that initial family, we don't survive. And in the social psychology, they say a self doesn't really start to cohere until between 4 and 6 years old. But the world also has an impact in terms of how we experience ourselves and if we, in fact, have a sense of belonging. So identity is socially constructed, not individually constructed. And this is important because a lot of times when people, especially have an identity that's maybe not as complementary, it's like, I'm going to pick a different identity. And while we have some role in terms of the identities we inhabit and the identities we live, it's not entirely up to us. When the police stops a Black man or Black woman, or now when people attack Asian Americans, it's not the Asian Americans that make those decisions. The attacker, if you will, is actually imposing an identity. The world is actually constraining who this person can be. So identity is socially constructed, which means if we're going to create healthier identities, we have to do it at a social level as well as an individual level. So we can use identities to increase polarization, or we can use identities to decrease polarization. But identities is going to play a substantial role. And some people get confused about this. They talk about identity politics as if we can have politics without identities. It's not identity that's the problem, it's breaking that's the problem. can we actually find ways to come together where we bridge and not break? And unfortunately, we have powerful leaders throughout the world that are trading on breaking, are trading on ethnic nationalism. Now, when they do that, part of the response for those of us who reject that is to break in response. So if you don't like me, I don't like you. And I'm not saying we shouldn't protect ourselves. I'm not saying we shouldn't struggle to actually resist what they say, but we have to do it in such a way that we don't end up adopting their way of being. If we do that, we've already lost. So white identity is not the same as racial prejudice. And this is, again, the book that I would recommend if you haven't read it. The point she's making is that, and she could extend it, she's talking about white people having more anxiety around their racial identity because their group is being threatened. Now, actually, she could extend that. And what we're saying is that rapid change actually creates stress for everyone. So everyone's sort of grappling with, who am I? I'm not exactly the same as I was 20 years ago. And I don't have complete control over it. There are other things happening that's actually changing how I experience myself. So think about it. Latinx. And is that the right term? For younger Latinx or Latinos, or whatever you might call them, that's more likely to say yes. For older people, it's no. Even the term Latin is contested to some extent. And we're not done. Remember, it's not a destination, it's a journey, but it's also who are you in relationship with? So part of this being in relationship means that we don't want to just talk to ourselves. So maybe there needs to be some intergenerational communications as people try to actually reclaim their identity. It's not just a word. The word has meaning. The word has symbols. And we're symbolic animals. So it's not bad that things have symbols. I grew up actually in the United States, started off really colored and then became a Negro at some point. And later, Black or African American. Each one of those words actually connotes something different. So it's not just a change in label, it's actually trying to make a statement about who we are and how we show up in the world. So in the 60s, early 60s, to call someone Black was fighting words. I'm not Black. Why do you call me Black? But through Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton and Malcolm X, they actually embraced the concept of Blackness. That while white people were calling us Blacks as an insult, they were claiming Blackness as power. And as soon as they did that, the dominant society started saying, don't call yourself Black. You know, you're not Black. In a sense, part of othering and part of identity is who gets to decide. When one group decides for another group, that's marginalization and most likely othering. When I get to name who you are and define you, I have all the power and you're just the subject of the power. And so Blackness, James Brown's song, Say It Loud, I'm Black and Proud, was fairly radical in its expression. Think about LGB, and then the letters keep expanding. In the 90s, it was just LGB, and then it expanded to include the T, and then it expanded to include the queer. Now, queer, again, was very much like Black. It was a derogatory term that the dominant society used against LGBTQ people. And at some point, the group claimed the term as a sense of power and self-affirmation. And you had the same kind of response. Why are you calling yourself queer? That's a bad word. Words are constantly being contested in their meaning, and we're not just fighting over words. We're fighting over the ability to co-create, the ability to name ourselves, the ability to have an effective voice. BIPOC. Some of you, so most of you have heard of this now, it's relatively new. Some people don't like the term people of color. It's too broad. It sort of meshes all these groups together. So let's have Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And as a way of actually addressing earlier problems with terms like non-white or minorities. And minorities is one of my least favorite words, because minority is not just a question of numbers. It's actually largely a question of power. It's saying you don't have power and therefore you don't have an effective voice. I live in California, and in California we say California, like Hawaii, is a majority minority state. And if that sounds like a mouthful and contradictory, it is. But what they're really saying is that even though whites are no longer the numerical majority, people of color, they're still a minority, even though they're collectively a majority. I'll leave you with that to sort of figure out. But we need a different nomenclature. So some people suggest BIPOC. But the term itself is not quite right. It sort of suggests that Blacks are not people of color. And some people say it's creating a binary, us versus them. And some people say, instead of saying people of color or BIPOC, let's just name the groups we're talking about. And then there are those, not so many anymore, who would say, can't we just not use labels at all? The answer to that question is no, we have to use labels, but how we use them and how rigid they are, we can actually play with. But the mind, the way the mind works, the way intelligence works, is to categorize. So we can't completely get rid of categories, but we can play with those categories. So there's an evolution about identity, and it's contested. The dominant group sort of trying to impose on the less dominant group making its own assertion. And even in that assertion, though, sometimes the more dominant group feels disease, because all of these things exist in relationship to each other. My identity only makes sense in the context of your identity. I lived in Africa. For the most part, especially in villages where I was, people don't think of themselves as Black. They obviously don't think of themselves as African Americans. They think of themselves in terms of their tribal identity. So Blackness in the United States has its most sharp meaning in relationship to whiteness. So these things are always in relationship, and sometimes relationship is hierarchical. And many of you may know this, there's been contestation and fights over how do you list things on the census? One of the more recent fights being over the term and concept of Hispanic. Can people claim multiple identities at once, or do they have to choose? And again, this is not just nomenclature. This is actually struggles around power and resources as well. But as much as we do and much as we think about this, we're not going to get it ultimately right. The identities we inherit, the identities we live in, the identities we will continue to change. But the question is, at least in my mind, what impact does this have on white supremacy? So it's not just, I want to claim a right identity for me. Really what I want to do is dismantle the ideology of white supremacy and create a society where everyone belongs and can co-create. Does my identity and my identity struggles support that? Or does it actually, in some ways, aid and abet the continuation of white supremacy as an ideology? And I'm sure you've seen that expression, you can't stick your hand in the same river twice. The idea the river is constantly changing, and it is, but so is your hand. So it's not just the environment that's changing. It is. The environment is changing. It's always changing, but it usually changes so slowly that we don't notice it. We don't notice that mountains are flowing, that mountains are like liquids. Over a long time frame, mountains move. But in a short time frame, they seem very stable. Same is true for all of us. What's happening now is that the river is moving faster and our hands are changing faster. and it's creating discomfort and disease. So part of the way we try to negotiate this is we make up stories. And sometimes we think these stories are real. Oftentimes we think they're real. And it's not that we can live without stories, but we can be aware that we're living in stories and that no story is complete. And so when you look at a story, just think about this. When you look at a story, just step back for a minute and think about who's the protagonist, who's the villain, and whose voice is being told. And when I was growing up, again, there were very few Black voices in telling stories. And if Black showed up in a story or in a movie, they were the villain. And that was just the way it was. And now that's being contested, and as it's being contested, it feels chaotic in some way. And so you have this notion of making America, make India great again. The idea of let's return to some golden age when everybody knew their place and everything was fine. There's no golden age. And of course, any age, there's some contestation going on. But really what people are saying is, I have this memory, this nostalgia of when Father Knows Best. You may not recognize Beaver and Father Knows Best. Think about that. A television program in the 50s and 60s that says Father Knows Best. Couldn't do that today. So these are fallacies, and they're used in part to help us make sense of an anxious world. And so you think about the fight around Confederate symbols, right? It's people trying to hold on to something that in a sense never was. But it doesn't make them bad necessarily. We all do that in some fashion. We all try to construct a sense of who we are, a sense of stability by constructing stories. And those stories are never complete and never completely accurate. So we have multiple stories. So can we move from the imagined past to a belonging future? And that's our charge. We're never going to get back to the imagined past, but we could maybe have a belonging future. It's not given. We have to work at that. We have to participate at that. And we have to do it again, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. And if we're going to move to an imagined future where we all belong, or a belonging future, we have to actually not just think about people, we have to think about structures. And we have to think about how to actually help people navigate fluid identities. And in a sense, that's where we are. A crack in the vessel. The world is changing very fast. Demographics are changing fast. It's calling for something new. And even the pandemic is reminding us over and over again that we are interconnected, that we're part of each other. Yes, you can, say no more planes from India or Latin America, but the virus finds a way because we are deeply, deeply interconnected. It's just a reality. And people have said that we will never get over the pandemic in the United States until we get over the pandemic in the entire world. So there's change, but just saying there's change is not enough. We have to help give birth to new possibilities, new identities, new ways of being. And I'm completely convinced that we will, but I'm not convinced that it will be a belonging world. It could be a very fractured world where we're constantly fighting against each other. In such a world, we have a short lifespan. But those are the two big ways in which we move forward, in which we all move together. We create belonging for the earth or each other, where we learn to care about each other, love each other, see each other without becoming each other. Or we create very small we's. If I had time, I'd go into it, but think about it. There was major wars in Europe. In 60 years, there were 3 major wars. And each war would get more and more intense. And part of the hope of the EU was if we can come together and have our multiple identities of being German and European, maybe we'll stop fighting each other. And while it hasn't been perfect, major wars have been largely avoided in Europe. So they've tried to construct a new identity, tried to construct new structures, tried to construct new money. But you can only do that by doing it together. And this is a quote from one of our first speakers at the Othering and Belonging Institute conference. And this is Andrew Solomon. And he talks about the best way to get to these horizontalities is to find coherence. And in the wake of those stories, I recast my own narrative. I have a horizontal. Horizontal basically means peer-to-peer, a horizontal experience of being gay, and a vertical one, that's what you're inheriting from your family. That's vertical. A vertical one, a family that produced me. And the fact that they are not fully integrated no longer seems to undermine either. So that's another thing, as we sort of bring together our multiple identities and also our identities with each other, they will never completely cohere. There will always be some contestation, both internally and externally, but we can actually move in that direction. And we can hold on to both. And so that's the project that we are partially embarking on. So there's a fight brewing. I'll talk a little bit more about bridging, and the fight is between vegetarians and vegans. Again, categories that we put ourselves in and that we organize around can be what I call short bridges or long bridges. But even when we call short bridges, sometimes there can be intense fights where we deny the other's humanity. Now, many people will say, what's the difference between vegan and vegetarian? Come see me after the conference and I'll tell you. And maybe you will recognize my friend Bell Hooks, also at one of our earlier conferences. And she makes observations that bridges are made to walk on. And by that, she means that if you become a bridger, if you become the bridge, you will be, in a sense, sometimes misunderstood. You will be walked on, hopefully not stomped on. And as my friend Lori Villarosa asks, as a bridger, what's the role? Where does a bridger belong? You're helping people come together, but sometimes the group that you're part of is like, why are you working with those people? They're not like us. And the people you're trying to work with is like, what are you doing here? You're not one of us. So a bridger has a very, very important role, but it can be a little lonely. And it can be like, so where does the bridger belong? And I want to suggest that we all should be bridgers. We may have to take a break from that at some time, but we all need to find ways to bridge. Small bridges, short bridges, and long bridges. And yet at times also we have to step back and be in a place where our belonging is not called into question. So a lot of work on bridging now is happening. I work with groups like the Einhorn Organization. There are funders, there's large institutions trying to bridge. And a lot of this work is informed by Robert Putnam. Just two quick things. One is that most of the work is interpersonal, people to people, and that's important. But the polarization that we're experiencing now is group-based. It's not individual-based. And what we need to bridge for groups is very different than what we need to bridge for individuals. And one of the differences is that you have to pay attention to power. I'm sure all of you have followed, many of you have followed, especially in the United States, what happened with Amazon. Shortly after the union was defeated, Jeff Bezos came out and talked about the need to actually support workers, but he just crushed the union effort. And so belonging is not simply asking for a handout, it's saying, I have an effective voice to co-create. So yes, thank you for your kind gift, but I'm asking for something more. I'm demanding something more. And what we see is that, I don't know if you can read this, the top left one is from Coca-Cola. These are all different businesses and corporations stepping into the place of saying, okay, we have purpose and values beyond just money. Now, for a lot of people, that would be met with a degree of skepticism. And it should be examined. What happens when values and interests conflict? But at the same time, as we bridge, we want to make sure we're open up, that we're not categorically saying because you're Coca-Cola or because you're a baseball team, you can't be on the side of belonging and justice. So we have to look at structures, we have to look at how we're positioned, and we have to look at how do we co-create and co-own in order to really create true belonging. And I've been talking a lot about belonging, and I'm just at the end of this PowerPoint, but belonging is without othering. Now, some people will say that's not possible. We don't know, and you recognize some of you, that's Pastor McBride, who's created belonging circles in the church. We're working with some cities that are trying to create belonging cities that goes beyond inclusion. So the effort is out there. How far can we go? We don't know. And again, maybe there is no ultimate destination, but the journey is important, and who you do it with is important. And we need to be willing to experiment. We don't know how everything will turn out. We don't know all the new possibilities. And so it requires us to actually engage in experimentation. How do we do this? One thing, this is my friend Iris Young. She died a few years ago. And I just want to acknowledge that this last year, it's been a lot of deaths, including in my own family, a lot of sorrow. But there's also been births and weddings, and so we have to hold on to both of those and honor those who are dead, and certainly stop the killings that have been going on. But we have to also be responsible for this future that we want to create. And Iris Young talks about when you look at structures and institutions, you're not talking about guilt, you're talking about responsibility. We are all responsible for creating a future where everyone belongs. Thank you. I'll be open for questions and comments.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I'm just getting situated again. I too was having some technical difficulties on my end. And of course, at the 11th hour, when you least expect it or want it to happen. But thank you so much, John, for your powerful and thought-provoking keynote speech. Just to introduce myself to everyone, my name is Basima Sizemore. I am a researcher in the Global Justice Program at the Othering and Belonging Institute. And it is wonderful to be here, and it is a great pleasure to be moderating the Q&A for John's keynote. So thank you again for that, John, and to get us thinking about the complexities of identity, how it can be mobilized as a source of othering or polarization, and of course, how it can be mobilized as a source of belonging and building the bigger we. And I think what you're inviting us to think about, to complicate, to collectively imagine, and to work toward is so important. And I'm really glad that we can all be here today to reflect on that together. So I'm going to just jump into the Q&A. There's a few questions that came up. The chat was buzzing. It was lively conversations happening. And so the first question for you, John, is some folks wonder about the relationship between the changes you mentioned and economic anxiety. You said that rapid change brings stress that gets taken out on others. Could this be a reason why populism and ethno-nationalism can crop in countries that are getting richer? In other words, is this why it's not simply about economic anxiety?
Well, thank you for the question. And yes, I mean, obviously I covered a lot of things. In fact, my friend and colleague, Stephen Menendez, says, you know, it's too much, you can't do this. Like in the United States, it's like, is it race, is it class? Is it, you know, is it economics, is it gender? It's all of those things. And they, you know, they don't exist in isolation. There's no complete story that you can tell just with economics. There's probably no complete story you can tell just with race. So yes, the economic anxiety actually feeds into othering, into breaking, and race is used to actually help create the economic anxiety, and so it becomes this vicious cycle. And But yes, the economic anxiety. So a lot of zero-sum thinking, a lot of scarcity thinking. It's like, if I win, you lose. And it doesn't have to be real in the sense that, but people can imagine it. And they looked at the people who actually stormed the White House in the insurrection, stormed the Capitol in the insurrection, and they found that most of them were not low-income people. Most of them were middle class, some of them were upper middle class, but they have a sense that they're about to lose. So it's anticipating loss. And the loss can be symbolic as well as material. And sometimes symbolic losses can even be more important than material losses. So it's not, so you don't pick one or the other. It's really a combination of those things and how they interact.
Thank you, John. I'm going to move us along into our second question. The second question is, do coalition identities, as in feminist, anarchist, and others, create more opportunity for belonging and building liberation movements across contested identities, or is that too simplistic an approach, in your opinion?
You could think of coalitions as sort of an early expression of bridging, but coalitions more often than not are transactional. You sort of come together to do one thing together, and it may be important. But what we're talking about is something deeper, something that happens on multiple levels, and people will come at it at multiple levels. So you have people, organizers or unions, or people in a political campaign. They're looking at an end goal, and those things are not unimportant. But you're really trying to do something much more profound. You're actually looking at a spiritual awakening, if you will, and to recognize people as people, period, even if they're not in your coalition. So we come to a coalition, and we work with people because for the moment we have shared interests. Again, not unimportant, but we're actually saying there's something deeper than that. We have a shared humanity, a shared emerging humanity, without being the same. So sometimes coalitions can actually be structured not only to win, but also to break. And it's hard because how do you actually, at a deep level, if I'm connecting with someone at a deep level, I'm not connecting with them just to change them. That's instrumental. If I say I see you, I say I see you because by seeing you, I can change you. That's instrumental. My care for you is predicated on your changing. So it happens at multiple levels. But having said that, coalitions can be one of the first steps, and it's partially a question of how we do the coalitions. And I can say, as some of you may know, we work with some of the largest unions in the United States, and certainly with grassroots groups, and they're stepping into this space themselves. They're grappling with how to build a deeper sense of belonging, even while they try to fight for certain particular campaigns.
Do you see more opportunities for coalition building at this time?
I think I do. I mean, what we see in the United States, for example, is that more and more people are starting to maybe break with the ideology of white supremacy. And the important part of that was that, first of all, more and more people have to recognize that we are existing under an ideology of white supremacy. And I say to people that the operative word in white supremacy is actually not the whiteness, it's the supremacy. That we really want to challenge supremacy wherever it shows up. Heterosexual supremacy, male supremacy, religious supremacy, which denies the possibility of coalitions, because one group is claiming that it's essentially better than and in charge of. But how we do these new relationships is being worked out. So, for example, I'm somewhat skeptical of extending the concept of allyship. Because an allyship suggests that one person's struggle, another person's just helping them. Whereas belonging suggests that we're in this together. We're doing something together. So changes are happening at such a deep level that our vocabulary, our grammar, our institutions are not quite up to speed to do the work we need to do to create a belonging world. But I think we're definitely leaning in that direction, which creates many more possibilities for not just coalitions, but for us to really turn to each other with care and love as well.
lots of could you comment on the?
Can you repeat that?
Hey, John, the question is, how important is shared space for a sense of identity and belonging and for bridging? Could you comment on the potential and challenges of sharing physical and digital space?
Well, I'm glad you added the last part of that, Stephen, because to some extent, obviously, those of you who studied this know that Alpert in 1954 wrote a book called The Nature of Prejudice, and he talked about contact theory. And the idea was that when people have contact, that is close proximity, under the right conditions, that stereotypes actually are diminished. You could say bridging happens. And so having physical proximity can be helpful, but there are other types of proximity as well, including, as you mentioned, digital. Harari, in one of his books, *Sapien*, he talks about we come together through stories, and that he notes that literally there are 2 billion people on the planet who share the narrative, the story, and I don't mean to denigrate it, of Christianity, and in that there's some commonality. But most of them will never see each other, speak a different language, have different foods. So there are multiple ways of doing it. Certainly physical space helps. And what we've done in the United States is organize physical space to keep us apart. So not only racially segregated, we also economically segregated, and we also generationally segregated. Most people just hang out with people who look like them and same age, and it makes it harder. And that's how our society is organized. We've also organized in such a way that we denigrate public space. So people, when they get a little money, they don't ride public transportation, and public transportation, we don't invest in it. We're not like Europe. So we have a lot of structures that actually facilitate us being pulled apart, facilitate us not knowing each other. And we have to address that. And so, but physical space can help, digital space can help, but culture can help as well. If people don't have the physical and physical space, how they know about each other are through stories, what they see on television, what they hear on the media. So I think we have to look at all these different mechanisms for getting to know each other and telling our stories.
As a follow-up question, how do we change public spaces to be more affirming, to create belonging, and to reduce marginalization?
A great question. The questioner might not know that Stephen, who's posing the question to me, was taking the lead on challenging the notion of single-family zoning in the United States, particularly in California. Now, zoning, again, may not seem like, well, that's kind of removed from the issue of belonging, but it's not, because zoning is how we organize physical space. And historically, when we created zoning in the United States, part of it was to separate, in particular, Blacks and Asians from whites. It was to do the work of making it easier to other people. Now, 100 years later, people don't remember that, but it's still doing much of the same work, with or without the emotional antipathy. So the hope was in 1954 in the United States, and I apologize for those of you who are not Americans that I'm focusing so much on the United States now, but in 1954, in Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court basically said one of the scourges of segregation was it kept people together, and it symbolically told Black children that you're not worthy. I mean, we have a Black Lives Matter meme, right? It's like, the reason we have that is that every day we're saying through thousands of ways, Black lives actually don't matter, that you don't belong here. So if you look at racial profiling in the United States, it happens not mainly in the Black community, it happens when Blacks go into the white community. And the police basically say, what are you doing here? You don't really belong here. So yes, we have an opportunity to do something different. So as we think about upzoning for neighborhoods, that is creating space where you can build multifamily housing, you can build affordable housing, you create the possibility that you have a more diverse set of people living together. That's not enough, but it certainly helps.
A number of people were wondering, John, about who are the elites that you mentioned in your talk, and also if you have any ideas for strategies for belonging. And I think we'll close the questions there.
So a couple of things. I encourage people to go to our website, because that's what we do all the time. We're working with a number of cities now, working with a number of foundations, a number of community groups, all around themes of belonging and helping people move even beyond just inclusion. In fact, the woman who's associated with diversity, equity, inclusion has actually said we got to move beyond that to belonging. And by that, I think she means, again, co-creating. And I would encourage people to take this on. It's to say, how do I create in my space, either small space, big space, university, hospital? How do I create belonging? And what are the things that are actually undermining it? In New York, for example, they recently was creating a building where they'd have rich people and middle class people. They had a separate entrance for the people who are middle class. So who are the elites? Well, in some cases, we're talking about stories. We're talking about narrative. So president is an elite. Head of corporations is an elite. Jeff Bezos is elite. They have money, resources, power, and they have the capacity to be heard, right? So that millions of people listen to everything they say. And so, for example, there was no difference between Democrats and Republicans on wearing a mask until Trump said, basically, real people don't wear masks. I'm not wearing one. That's what Trump said. And then all of a sudden, wearing a mask became politicized, if not weaponized. He has the capacity, even now, to do that. So we all have some capacity. None of us are powerless, but power is not evenly distributed. And there's very good research. There's a book called How Democracy Dies. And the authors in that book, two professors from Harvard, know that authoritarianism and autocratic leaders always have some portion of the elites, political and financial elites, align with them before they come to power. They don't do it by themselves. And so I think it's very heartening. It's too early to celebrate that, both in terms of the verdict that just came out of Minneapolis, but also in terms of what's happening with a number of corporations pushing back on voting rights, pushing in favor of voting rights and pushing back against restricting the votes. And they're doing that with a certain degree of discomfort. It's like, well, that's not really what we were designed to do. You saw the same thing in terms of divestment around apartheid in South Africa, which many of you may have participated in. I certainly did. And you had Artists Against Apartheid, but that was directed at the banks. And it was basically saying the banks are the elites, and without support of the banks, financial and otherwise, it's harder for apartheid to live. So we don't normally think of those groups. We don't normally think about reaching out to the elites and seeing how far they will go in terms of supporting belonging. And what I was suggesting in terms of that slide with Jeff Bezos, it's not that, Bezos is the richest or second richest man in the world. And his noblesse oblige for the hundreds of thousands of workers working at Amazon, that's great, but it's not belonging. But to say you don't have a right to decent working conditions, you don't have a right to a decent salary, but I might give you something, that's not belonging. And so it has to go beyond that. And so while we want the elite involved, we want to make it clear we're not just asking for a handout. We're asking for something else. We're demanding something else. And they have a role to play. And then, of course, you have political elites and cultural elites and, who are the influence? Who do people listen to?